So today's Digital Humanities colloquium is called Making Strange, co-creating Afrikaans poetry with a boutique language model. And the presenter is Imke van Heerden. So Dr. Imke van Heerden is a visiting assistant professor at Koç University in Istanbul. She's a recipient of the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey's International Fellowship for Outstanding Researchers from 2020 to 2023. And a principal investigator of AI as author, an interdisciplinary research project that brings literary studies into conversation with natural language generation. And I think your presentation is on that as well. She received her PhD in English literature from the University of York in 2016 as a Commonwealth Scholar and doctoral fellow of York's Humanities Research Center. Her first book called Zilverwit in die Zon toe, Afrikaanse eerste KI-gedichten. So that's Silver White in the Distance. Please forgive my Afrikaans. Silver White in the Distance, the first AI poetry in Afrikaans, has just been published with Naledi. So I'll stop here and I'll give the floor to you, Imke. I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Menu. I think, would it be all right if I could just now share my screen as well? Yeah, cheers, thank you. All right, so Menu, would you mind just confirming that the slide is filling the screen?
Yep, this looks good to me.
All right, thank you so much. And I just want to say your Afrikaans is beautiful. It's the first time I hear the title of the poetry collection in a Dutch accent. It sounds beautiful. Yes, greetings from Istanbul. I'm Imke, and I'm a visiting assistant professor at Koç University. And it really is an honor to be invited to the Digital Humanities Colloquium series. I love this idea of Digital Humanities Ignite events, the first I've heard of this. Maybe you should have one in Turkey. So thank you very much for this invitation. And the title of my talk today is Making Strange, Co-creating Afrikaans Poetry with a Boutique Language Model. And yes, as has just been written in the chat, if you have any questions, please write them. I don't know if I'll be able to answer them as we go along, but certainly afterwards. And I do appreciate everyone being here. I know everyone's really busy, and I'm mindful of the fact that we have only an hour, so I'll be keeping my one eye on the time. All right, so broadly, we may situate the study at the intersection of natural language generation, literary studies, and poetic practice. So specifically in this talk, I present an LSTM-based approach to figurative language generation from a rather unique vantage point, that of literary studies. And we trained the proposed network on a single literary novel, which is also rather unusual. And the model generates phrases that contain original figures of speech, like the example on the screen. Die lewe in hierdie nuwe hande waar ek algoritmies kuier. The life in these new hands where I socialize algorithmically. So these phrases are then used as part of our experimental integration of computational and poetic practices. So I will begin by introducing my research project, AI as author. Then I will discuss our boutique language model, which we affectionately call AfriKI, in addition to the dataset, of course. Then I will discuss the results alongside a reflection on evaluation in creative text generation. I will then explain our machine-in-the-loop approach to poetry generation, and finally, how that led to the creation of the first volume of co-creative AI poetry in Afrikaans. So please note that this presentation is mainly based on the publications listed on screen, especially towards figurative language generation in Afrikaans, and also AfriKI machine-in-the-loop Afrikaans poetry generation. And these studies were presented at ACL events in 2021 and are available in the ACL anthology. Now that's approximately two years ago. So as a result, I felt somewhat conflicted about presenting this particular work to you today. So to explain, to some NLG researchers, this work may seem perhaps a little outdated, since many of us, of course, know the field has advanced at such an incredible rate. However, I recently published a book, Silverwit and Swiintu, or loosely translated as Silver White in the Distance. And there has been some interest in the collection. So I thought it might be interesting to discuss with you the research that underpins this collection. So some of the ideas and some of the questions that led to its creation. So even if the technology itself is not scientifically highly relevant, I do hope that the overall approach gestures towards promising alternatives within the vast field that is AI. All right, so before I explain our work on Afrikaans text generation, I'd like to introduce my overarching research project, AI as Author. So as mentioned, I'm based in Istanbul, where I lead a small research team funded by Turkey's Scientific Research Council. And the project's goal is simple. It brings into conversation two seemingly unrelated fields, namely literature and machine learning. And the senior researcher on the project is Dr. Anil Bash, who specializes in machine learning, whereas my background is in literature. So it follows that I'm intrigued by creative text generation specifically. And of course, what's challenging and exciting about such interdisciplinary work is reconciling different methodologies and priorities. So in creating a shared language between disciplines. So our focus on Afrikaans is actually only one of our focus areas. So if you'd like to learn more about our work, please visit our website. What initially inspired our project was the World Economic Forum's prediction that AI will write a New York Times bestseller by the year 2049. And this is actually based on a study by Grace and colleagues. They conducted a large survey asking AI experts, when will AI exceed human performance? And indeed, AI writing technologies progressed so rapidly since then that the date will be much sooner if readers consent, that is. Now, in 2018, NLG was not nearly as sophisticated as it is today. And at the time, specifically at that time, I found that there was a near complete absence of literary scholars in creative text generation research. So computational linguists, of course, but no literary scholars. So to clarify, there were various poetry generation studies, for example, but almost none involved literary scholars. And I decided to investigate by way of this project. So when we started almost 4 years ago, we were really interested in practical ways in which literary expertise could contribute to the development and evaluation of creative text generation. And specifically, we worked on identifying and bringing potentially useful ideas from literary studies to AI research. And one of our main questions was, and still is, how might literary perspectives help steer creative text generation research in other directions that are perhaps more aligned with literary scholarship? Now, as one attempt, we proposed in 2021 a generative language model called AfriKI. Now, AfriKI is an abbreviation for Afrikaanse Kunsmatige Intelligensie, or Afrikaans AI. Now, I'm South African. My mother tongue is Afrikaans, which is why I was drawn to experimentation in the language. Now, the novelty of our two AfriKI studies lies in the choice of language, as well as our co-creative approach, and I will discuss co-creativity in a later section today. So regarding our choice of language, at the time of publication of our two AfriKI studies, Masekane showed that NLP research in African languages is underrepresented, and this was true of Afrikaans as well. So although at the time studies and data sets were available, text generation in Afrikaans was very limited. So in other words, there was some activity around the language in natural language processing, and certainly in South African languages in general. And you may find some studies from ACL indexed events listed on the slide. However, to our knowledge, ours was the first study to attempt creative text generation in Afrikaans. Now, in the taxonomy of Joshi and colleagues, Afrikaans may be considered a relatively low resource language. So to clarify, there are many languages in the world today, but historically, language technologies have focused only on a small subset of these. And as a result, it is a priority for ACL, the Association for Computational Linguistics, to promote research in low resource and endangered languages. On the upside, though, we have always believed that low resource languages offer exciting opportunities for experimentation, collaboration, and growth. Now, since the release of ChatGPT, some are reasonably negative and fearful about language AI, about AI endangering human writing and wreaking general havoc. And of course, this is completely understandable. But I also want to say that many NLP researchers working in low resource languages are probably not doing so because they want to endanger the language. On the contrary, the aim is to make sure that low resource languages are adequately represented. I mean, some of these languages have faced a significant challenge because they do not possess the necessary resources. They may be left behind. So the key point here is that language, of course, plays an important role in the development of artificial intelligence. So we need to develop AI research in local languages to ensure they keep pace. And I embarked on this research out of genuine curiosity and love for Afrikaans as a literary language. And in my research, I found wonderful examples of AI-generated poetry in English, Chinese, Polish, Portuguese, did I say French, even Bengali. And I wanted to add Afrikaans to this growing list of languages in which AI poetry was being created. All right, but in a computational context, why focus on figurative language? Why is, for example, metaphor important in creative writing? What is potentially useful about this work? Now, metaphor is a vital resource that is often associated with originality. And interestingly, because it is open-ended, original figurative language invites the reader to participate in the process of meaning making, thus facilitating connection between reader and text. So compared to metaphors in everyday speech, unusual metaphors stand out, and in literature, capture readers' attention. And furthermore, it has been argued that original metaphors communicate greater emotional intensity than conventional metaphors. So to summarize, it seems the more unexpected the metaphor, the better. So I don't wish to generalize, but some areas of improvement in generated poetry still appear to be emotional impact, depth, and originality. And a possible implication of the ideas shared on the previous slide is that the presence of original metaphor in generated poetry might help solve this problem to an extent. It might enhance the perception of originality, creativity, emotion, and memorability, as well as help capture readers' attention and facilitate connection. All right, now I just use the word problem, which is interesting, right? As an aside, as I mentioned before, when we started our project, we were interested in practical ways in which ideas from literature could improve creative text generation. So bringing ideas from literary studies to AI. And this is one example, and that was one goal. But we are very much a multifaceted and interdisciplinary team with various concerns. So sometimes these concerns and questions may clash. So to an NLP audience, and I expected that, there might be a few NLP researchers here today, one might emphasize that original metaphor could lead to the improvement of generated text. But of course, at a literary conference, I would emphasize other questions. For example, how generated text solicits reconceptualization of originality, creativity, and the reading experience. So one research community takes it for granted that we should improve AI, whereas another community might question whether that is at all necessary and even ethical. All right, now I will briefly discuss the model and data set. So as regards architecture, we, and by we, I mostly mean my co-author, Dr. Anilbash, we experimented with several architectures and obtained best results with 2-layer LSTM architecture. We stacked 2 LSTM layers with 50 units in each layer, followed by dropout layers, then a fully connected layer, and a softmax layer. We used the Adam optimizer and trained for 300 epochs. So regarding the data set, we personally didn't have access to a large poetry data set, which poetry generation typically requires, so we followed an alternative approach. So we did not train on poetry, but rather on an Afrikaans literary novel, Die Bibliotheek aan die einde van die wêreld, which is translated as A Library to Flee. The word cloud shows the novel's most commonly used words, after, of course, stop words were removed. And note that Ian and Tuli are the novel's protagonists. So training on a novel did work, and the reason lies in the style of writing. So the text is rich in figurative language. So similar to the trained data, our network outputs unique phrases. Now, I need to mention that we did not set out to generate figurative language per se. This means that there's no specific components to enforce rules or constraints on the model. But once we regarded the text as figurative, we realized how this could enrich generated text. I would also like to mention that the theme of artificial intelligence is central to this novel, The Library at the End of the World. It's highly apt in this context. So to those that are not familiar with the field of NLG, AfriKI is by no means a large language model like those that are dominating the headlines these days. And we may call it a boutique language model, with boutique suggesting something small and bespoke and therefore precisely unique. So in peer reviews, one sometimes gets asked the question, can this be replicated? So replication is seen as important. But from a literary perspective, isn't uniqueness always a good thing? I mean, uniqueness is what distinguishes AfriKI from a publicly available giant such as ChatGPT. All right, so on to the results. On the screen, I show example results of our figurative language generation. And I think the translations don't necessarily do justice to the originals, given the distinctiveness of some of the formulations, as well as the compounding nature of Afrikaans. But I think it gives a good sense nonetheless. You may notice metaphor, personification, simile in some of the results. And I will now draw your attention to some of them as I discuss evaluation. All right, so please note that much of this section specifically is based on our paper as author published in the Journal of Artificial Intelligence Research. Now, evaluation is considered a vital stage in the development process, right? It is a stage that helps to determine the success of the model, so the success of the AI. So in other words, evaluation is the term used in scientific research in NLG, including creative text generation. So it's expected in the field to use evaluation to determine the quality of a language model's output. So to verify how good your AI model actually is. And the aim of text generation is typically achieving human likeness. So the success of the generated text is thus related to its display of human qualities. And if you're not familiar with evaluation, I will talk about this a bit more since it's really important, I think. It is usually conducted by means of predetermined criteria, which are considered indicators of human likeness, which I think is really interesting. The idea that fluency and coherence, for example, are considered indicators of human likeness. More on that in a bit. So these evaluations are really important because they play a part in directing creative text generation research. And as you know, from the start of the project, I've always believed that this is where literary scholars can truly make a valuable contribution, right, at the evaluation stage. Now, if you are in NLG, you may know that evaluation in creative text generation especially is considered challenging, and there really is still much work to be done on evaluation criteria for creative text generation specifically. And if you're interested, there are usually many international workshops on this so-called problem of evaluation in NLG. Okay, so let's understand this better. Let's look at a prominent example from 2019 from none other than OpenAI. And this focuses on GPT-2. Now, GPT-2, of course, powers ChatGPT. Now, in evaluation of this model, OpenAI mentioned weakness in ChatGPT. So according to Radford and colleagues, at times, the model, GPT-2, sometimes generated failures, such as on the screen, fires happening underwater. So for GPT-2, the aim is to produce clear, informative text. So yes, then this topic is unsuitable. A metaphor which is common in poetry may look like an error, right, if interpreted literally. However, if read figuratively, the notion of fires happening underwater is rather intriguing from a literary perspective. Therefore, what might be considered a weakness in standard factual text could be considered a strength in creative text. So here's another example from 2017, Hopkins and Keeler's well-known poetry generation study. I've added one of the study's generated poems on the slide. You will notice there's meter. The crow crooked on, more beautiful and free, he journeyed off into the quarter sea. So Hopkins and Keeler succeeded in generating high-quality rhythmic verse, and to evaluate their results, they conducted an indistinguishability test. So what does that mean? You are giving your human evaluators, your judges, a mix of poems that are either generated or produced by the model or human written. And this is interesting, right? In this test, the evaluators, the judges, found the generated verse, so the AI generated verse, to be more human-like than those actually written by humans. Now, as a literary scholar, my attention was drawn to the following, and this is not explored in their study, understandably so, but half of the group of human evaluators misjudged the writing of Dickinson, Dryden, Tennyson, and Shakespeare as AI generated. So I'll say that again. Half of the group of evaluators mistook the writing of these well-known authors as machine generated. And Shakespeare's A Fairy Song, which you can see on the slide, received the lowest human likeness score. So in other words, this was perceived as AI generated. Now, of course, this can be related to unfamiliarity with Elizabethan English. But as another example, Dickinson's I'm Nobody was misjudged as well. So it's, of course, entirely open to discussion whether the evaluation results would coincide if evaluators were presented with only contemporary literary works, right? So written in present day English. Nonetheless, the results might suggest that participants mistook difficulties and peculiarities as flaws, that is, as an indication of AI. So clarity as a quality associated with human writing, whereas difficulty and peculiarity associated with AI. So just as an aside, I've always made the argument that NLG, specifically poetry generation studies, should involve literary scholars. And I think this also just shows the importance of actually including true experts in evaluation. So for example, if you're generating text in the style of Shakespeare, maybe ask a Shakespearean scholar to be on the team of evaluators. All right, so back to the main point. Perhaps this revealed a misunderstanding of poetry. Poetic texts have, in fact, been described as ambiguous, confusing, elusive, inaccurate, incorrect, peculiar, unreliable, unclear, and uncertain. And it's a typically dense form of literature that, importantly, may use ambiguous and abstract language deliberately and offer interpretive difficulties. According to FAB, some poetry, including traditional poetry, is for social or aesthetic reasons intended to be difficult. And literary scholars frequently pay attention to ambiguity in texts. And ambiguity is any verbal nuance, however slight, which gives room for alternative reactions to the same piece of language. It lies among the very roots of poetry. So after all, a poem may say one thing, but mean another. So the point here is that creative writing, for example, poetry, can be different than standard factual informative text. So the difference between ordinary and poetic language is a central theoretical concern. From a formalist perspective, for example, new and strange uses of language make poetry poetry and not a weather report. Jacobson famously referred to organized violence committed on ordinary speech. And there's a concept that comes to mind here, defamiliarization. So the artistic technique of presenting to readers familiar things in an unfamiliar way, inspiring new insights and emotions. So something that allows us to see the world in a new or fresh light. So defamiliarization is a reader's reaction to any textual feature that is unexpected. And this has been shown to capture readers' attention, to interest readers. And I'm only guessing here. I think NLG researchers need to weigh in here, but I was initially interested why so many researchers were drawn to poetry generation. And I think in some cases, it's not because researchers were interested in poetry per se, but because of rhyme and meter, right? So this challenge of trying to replicate rhythm and rhyme in generated text, right? An interesting challenge. However, if the aim is to generate text that can be considered truly poetic, we must remember that not all kinds of poetry possess, for example, rhyme, and certainly not all kinds of poetry are traditional. And poets use countless techniques and devices to achieve defamiliarization, to take readers out of their comfort zones, if you will. For example, just to mention a few, asyntactic structure, anastrophe, anadiplosis, and ambiguity. So on the slide, you can see two well-known examples of typographic experimentation by Ezra Pound and E.E. Cummings. And if you look here at a leaf falls, rhyme and meter are clearly absent. So in other words, rules or conventions are perhaps what is appealing about poetry generation to some. However, simply put, for many, rules were meant to be broken. In fact, creativity has been associated with a deliberate departure from norms. And I wholeheartedly agree that creativity must deal not with the predictable and repeatable, the stuff of normal science, but with the unique and unrepeatable. Thus, using strict adherence to rules as an indication of human likeness is not necessarily effective. So with this in mind, a poem that is difficult to understand, that is peculiar, or that breaks rules does not lack humanity. In fact, difficulty, peculiarity, complexity, ambiguity, novelty, and innovation, these are important characteristics of many kinds of poetry. So therefore, when these qualities are present in generated creative text, we believe it does not signify weakness or failure. So let's turn to Van der Lee's 2021 review of human evaluation criteria. So this is criteria that is often used in text generation. And I am not disputing that these are appropriate for standard text generation. And you can see here a few that we can imagine guided the development of GPT: fluency, grammaticality, coherence, readability, appropriateness, and clarity. However, the prioritization of these evaluation categories in poetry generation, so in figurative language generation, might be counterproductive if it loses sight of important poetic qualities. And this is due to the difference between ordinary and poetic language. Okay, so let's apply a few of these categories to our figurative language studies results. And let's ask, are these results successful? All right, let's start by applying fluency. Overall, the results do lean towards the fluent side. Informativeness. Can a creative metaphor really be informative? Let's look at this example. Ek is geld want niks kan bloei nie. I am money because nothing can bleed. It communicates meaning, but it's not informative. And what about coherence? Not necessarily. Looking at the same example, internal consistency is lacking. And clarity? possible, but that's also debatable. In fact, it to an extent depends on how you define these categories, and success may depend on the categories one chooses to apply to one's results. And as you can see, if the results were evaluated according to these standard evaluation categories for generated text, there is a chance that the results wouldn't do too well. Nevertheless, I personally find them promising in a poetic context. I find them intriguing and often highly original. And as mentioned, the more unusual and unexpected the metaphor, the better. So in other words, lacking logic, well, that's not necessarily a problem in creative text generation. All right, so since I published my book, the question I've probably received the most is, what is the difference between AfriKI and ChatGPT? So I thought it would be interesting to use ChatGPT to generate a few metaphors in Afrikaans. I'll just read the English. For example, anger is a burning fire that destroys everything in its path. Music is a stream of emotions that make our hearts sing. Now, I think we can clearly see these ideas at work here, right? These are fluent, they're informative, they're coherent, and they are clear. But how original are they? So I tried again, and here's some well-known phrases popped up in Afrikaans, like sy het 'n hart van goud, she is a heart of gold. Die wêreld is 'n oester, the world is an oyster. Not original. So I had to try one more time, and I believe this is better. Die maan se glimlag is 'n kitsvlam van hoop wat die donker verjaag. The moon's smile is a quick flame of hope that dispels the darkness. You can see I tried really hard here, right? An incredibly innovative poetic phrase with figurative meaning in Afrikaans. Now, if you're an expert, you would immediately realize this, no doubt, but I'm no expert in prompt engineering, and I'm sure others might be able to get more out of ChatGPT. I don't know why the quality isn't astonishing. Perhaps this is related to the training data. And I'm also not quite sure comparably what could be generated in English. But I thought it would be interesting to just briefly compare our results to these. I also want to say, ChatGPT is, of course, of great academic importance in how, large language models could potentially change our world. But I must say, I personally don't find it creatively interesting. Whereas these AfriKI studies, this has been one of the most creative activities of my life. So let's return to our study's results. I must now be very clear about this. AfriKI is not particularly fluent. Sometimes the model generates gibberish, and AfriKI certainly can't create an entire poem. There are many grammatical errors with little coherence between lines of verse. Yet, the generated text at times contains, at least to me, incredible formulations. And I wonder, perhaps it is the lack of fluency that lends an alienating and intriguing feeling to the text. All right, we can imagine applying different categories, perhaps, to these results. And these are categories that we discuss in our the article that I mentioned before in the Journal of Artificial Intelligence Research. Perhaps these are more suitable to poetry generation. I think we could describe many of these phrases as original, ambiguous, peculiar, and ultimately defamiliarizing. Let's focus on this metaphor. Democracy was a roof garden. So from one perspective, this could be a bad metaphor because the referents don't share any obvious similarities, or don't they? So some believe that unexpected associations between disparate concepts are perhaps more useful or interesting in a literary context. So generally speaking, as a literature-focused team, we don't expect our output to meet predetermined criteria. So instead, when we discover something compelling in generated text, we ask, to what extent are current evaluation frameworks able to value that quality? So our argument, therefore, is that poetic language may pose a deliberate challenge to interpretation, and this also poses a challenge to evaluation in poetry generation. So we suggested in our article that literariness, or that which constitutes a text as literary or poetic, was, at least at the time, understudied in relation to text generation, and that literary theoretical perspectives would be beneficial to creative AI. And as mentioned, especially at that time, finding literary scholars involved in the field was surprisingly uncommon. So one of the purposes of publishing this article and also starting our overall research project was really to encourage collaboration. So as one instance, I must mention that originality is, of course, an urgent question that's on everybody's minds right now. And I think that can only be solved by interdisciplinary collaboration between, for example, computational linguists, literary studies, AI, and certainly legal studies. And in 2020, Klebanov and Madnani stated that there is no operational scoring system that prioritizes originality in generated text. Measurement criteria of originality have yet to be determined and have even been considered unachievable by some. And in a literary context, Gross explains that attempts at categorization may fail to do justice to the uniqueness and power of poetry and therefore require great dexterity. So returning to my previous point, a question to you would be, how and by which principles would you try to determine whether generated text is any good, right? Whether it is novel or nonsensical. And what is interesting is our framing of the generated text as metaphorical. Right? So to remind you of previous section, because we present the results as metaphorical, they appear open to interpretation. The metaphorical language invites the reader to participate in the process of meaning making, and perhaps that contributes to an impression of intent and sentience. And on that note, Emily Bender puts it well. We now have machines that can mindlessly generate words, but we haven't learned how to stop imagining a mind behind them. Although such models are sometimes impressive, generating poetry or correctly answering trivia questions, they have no sense of the meaning of language, which causes them to also create gibberish. Now, for your interest, last year I gave a talk at the University of Johannesburg, and the audience consisted mainly of academics and I think some students in Afrikaans literature, as well as even an author or two. And some were so kind as to take part in this short survey or evaluation, answering the following 3 questions. Firstly, how would you rate the quality of AfriKI's generated phrases? 3.7 out of 5. Would you read a literary text created with AI? Most of them said yes, I would find it interesting. And then I also asked, do you think AI-assisted writing will become the norm? And I also have to say that this is before the release of ChatGPT, by the way. So at the time of conducting that survey, I was working on my AI poetry collection, and I found the feedback rather encouraging. So I would now like to conclude the last section of the talk to briefly discuss with you my machine-in-the-loop approach to AI poetry generation. So thus far, I've proposed an approach to figurative language generation with very limited data, and briefly addressed the evaluation problem in creative text generation alongside our results. I will also touch on evaluation in this section. So here in this second AfriKI study, we use AfriKI as an authoring tool to explore machine-in-the-loop Afrikaans poetry generation. And this is specifically a human-centered approach that promotes human creativity. Whereas NLG typically focuses on fully automatic text generation, so that is without humans, we believe that creative industries would benefit more from co-creative approaches and creativity support tools. So therefore, I deliberately use AI as an instrument to augment human creativity. And our approach is co-creative because I created poetry with the assistance of our model, AfriKI. There is human involvement here, there is human agency. And I really must emphasize here that many renowned teams have as their goal generated text that is 100% grammatically fluent, grammatically correct and fluent. But we as a literature-focused team, we've always been intrigued and even delighted by the strangeness, the weirdness of AI-generated text. And we don't see strange phrases generated by AI as a flaw, as many teams do, and instead embrace that defamiliarizing aspect. All right, so very briefly onto the process of co-constructing the poems. This consists of two stages. First, the network generates thousands of original individual lines. And then the human poet, which is me, selects phrases at will and then vertically arranges them into poems. This approach results in minimalist free verse poems, and I include some examples here on the slide. So as I mentioned, NLG categories of evaluation have at times tended to prioritize rhythm and rhyme, but in fact, in literature, free verse poems are a modern form of poetry that do not necessarily follow such rules. And I think there are really clearly expressive or poetic elements in the text. There are poetic devices such as alliteration and assonance. Imagery and figurative language are prevalent, especially personification. For example, Africa drinks and the landscape tilts its back. Right, and here's another example. Cape Town, today we are not just the city, but the translator of the sun. So as you know, some of you here today, Afrikaans, of course, has a rich literary tradition. And I explored by means of this work, the idea that creative text generation with AI could have the potential to enrich poetic language. And this is interesting. Alongside Afrikaans varieties, there is also some English in this novel. And this influenced the generated text in interesting ways. So as one example, in English, we might say sunlight, suns, the promenade. Sonlig, son die promenade. So it's fine in English to use a noun such as sun also as a verb, but we don't do that in Afrikaans. But the model adopted this and a few other patterns from English, generating novel phrases. And what was interesting to me is that they did not strike me as anglicized. Instead, there was something really beautiful to me about it. So this is a phrase generated by AfriKI, sonlig, son die promenade. And here's another one, sy wil die glasvensters deurkoesy. I don't think it works in English, but she wants to door frame the glass windows. I think in Afrikaans, it really contributes to the novelty and defamiliarization here. So this is a short summary of this section. And if you're interested in the 2 AfriKI studies, there are also presentations available on YouTube. All right, so from there, from a few poems, I started thinking of a poetry collection, and over the course of 2 years on and off, I worked on a book which has just been published by Naledi. So now here, the human creativity really, in a sense, took off, because from creating individual poems, I set to work creating a collection with themes, right? Even different sections with different emphases. There are some section titles which are also AI generated. So human creativity truly entered this picture, where I started working on a collection. All right, and just a few ideas in conclusion that ultimately underpin this book. I mean, this book is in a sense the culmination of my research project and the embodiment of some of the ideas and questions that we've explored and raised over the past 3 years. I would say the first one is the difference between literary and ordinary language. The second one is co-creativity. I think it's really significant that the first book of AI poetry is a co-creative text in which human intervention plays an extremely important role. Also, this idea of using AI as an instrument or a device that makes language strange. In other words, the emphasis doesn't fall on full automation, but on the augmentation of human creativity through the defamiliarization of language. So conceiving AfriKI as a device for making language strange, using it as an artistic tool or technique. So simply, poetry may be regarded as a language laboratory, and I drove this experiment further with the help of AfriKI. And here are also a few of the main questions that underpin the work. And I mean, since we published this article, this of course has been raised, you know, with so many large language models being released last year. And the final key question, of course, relates to literary value. Now, what of literary value? What should we make of this, right? And if there's still time today, maybe we can talk a little bit about that. So ultimately going forward, and I think this colloquium series, of course, plays such an important role there. I cannot but emphasize the importance, of course, of interdisciplinarity and collaboration, and all of us trying our utmost to not work in silos in our respective academic fields as AI's influence expands. I'm very grateful to my funders, and here are my references. So I think I took up a lot of time with my talk menu, but you know, if people want to stick around for just a little bit more, maybe we can go through some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear